Today, Apple filed a formal opposition to last week's federal mandate to create a tool that would allow the FBI to bypass the security in the iPhone 5C that was owned by the employer of one of the terrorists who killed 14 people in San Bernardino last year. Now, Ian, you read the entire 40-plus page motion. What is the most important thing that people should know about it?
Well, Apple is saying that it would be technically possible to do what the FBI asked, but it would be a breach of their constitutional rights as a company. It would be incredibly dangerous, and it would open the company up to basically being another arm of law enforcement. I mean, if you read through the memo, they destroy every single one of the government's arguments as to why this would be a good idea.
They also, I mean, last week we talked about how a lot of people, the FBI was saying Apple's just using this for marketing, which, I said, well, that doesn't really make sense because it doesn't look good because it looks like they're siding with the terrorists. But a lot of people pointed out that in this opposition, it says, the FBI is the one that has been talking about this in a way that they haven't talked about cases in the past, blogging about it. What do you make of that?
Yeah, this has been something that's really quite interesting. I mean, Apple has been helping the FBI on hundreds, if not thousands of cases where they've got a legitimate, where there's stuff that they can actually do. But in this case, generally those are kept under seal. But in this case, for some reason, the FBI actually wanted this out in public, and against Apple's wishes, as I understand it, went public with this in a very sort of media frenzy sort of a way. I think, to be honest, this really doesn't look good for the FBI, because what it means is that they were wanting to set this one up as a test case to build some case law in the courts. And you can see why, terrorists, 14 people dead. It's the kind of thing that's traditionally used to scare Americans into giving up their rights. So, I mean, it was a very carefully picked case, I think, by the FBI. And I think that really got Apple's sort of the hair up on the back of their neck. And, they really realized that they've got to fight this one. And the rest of the tech industry has, by and large, come in behind them on it.
Yeah, I mean, today, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, they're all supporting. I guess Google and Facebook are going to also file motions in support, and then Microsoft will follow. It is interesting. I think we've made a lot of comparisons in the last week. We talk about safes, and we talk about keys, and we talk about Second Amendment rights and free speech. And one thing I was thinking about today was, I lived through the whole Microsoft case, against the government. And in that point, I think we all sort of felt like the government was really protecting us, regulating in a way to protect us. But this is so different.
Yeah, I mean, and particularly when you consider that, this was to do this, they're using a law that was written in 1789. I mean, it's a phenomenally broad use of the law itself. And yeah, I think the tech industry realizes what is going on here and what actually needs to be done. I have to say, I was a bit disappointed with Google's initial statements on the matter. They seemed rather tepid. And Bill Gates reportedly said that the FBI did have a right to actually search on these phones, and then rolled it back a bit. And he was like, well, that's not exactly what I said, and then gave another bunch of interviews. But generally, the tech industry is behind this, and the FBI, I think, is getting a little bit worried that they may have stuck their toes into a hornet's nest.
Yeah, it could go either way, I suppose, because Apple's pressed so hard with it, it could go the other way. And then you realize, hey, because they pressed so hard with it in the other direction, it brought about all this change that the tech industry does not want. We actually have gotten a ton of email, but just real quick here, one of the points from one of the emailers was the question of whether there's precedent around requiring a company to create something specifically for their case in this case. Clarence McDowell says, has any government ever successfully compelled a company or person to create unique speech program for its benefit? On free speech terms, doesn't Apple have the right not to speak? What do you think about that, Ian?
Yeah, well, this is something that Apple brought up in the motion, and they were saying, the very notion that they are being compelled to make tools for the government is going to be one of the central planks of their case. I mean, there have been rumors that this sort of thing has gone on before. I mean, we're talking about Windows 95 and the suspected backdoor for the NSA. But when it comes to actually creating a new operating system, they call it Government OS in the court filing. It's fraught with problems because they reckon it would take 6 to 10 engineers who would have to work solely on this, probably for about 4 weeks to actually come up with the software. Then once the software has been used once, it has to be destroyed. Because if it goes to the FBI, it could be stolen, because we all saw from the Office of Personnel Management that government IT security is not particularly good. And then once they'd actually created it, Apple could be subpoenaed, and in the legal proceedings going on, they would have to explain how they created it. So that would make hackers' ears really prick up. And if they followed the case closely, they could get some clues as to how to balk Apple's operating system. But I think the company is fighting back on this. And the next iteration of iOS, we're going to see, I think Apple has learned what it needs to do in order to make sure that it can't do this sort of thing in the future.
Yeah, that's exactly what they want, right? One thing Apple wants more than anything right now is not to be in the position of having any sort of actual access to locked iPhones or the protected information on them. As such, the company is working on new modes of security that would prevent the feds from the access that they seek in this case. Apple could do this because of federal wiretap laws don't currently force tech companies into making its data accessible the way it compels phone carriers to do currently. And Congress would have to get involved for that to change. So until then, Apple will do what it can to remove themselves from the equation entirely. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This is because, I mean, they referenced the Clear legislation, which has been used. And you're right, that's specifically for telecommunications providers, whereas Apple is technically an information provider, and as such isn't really covered by that. Now, the government was considering doing Clear 2 legislation, which would have enforced that, but the Obama regime sort of backed off from that towards the end of last year and basically decided to let the courts sort it out. It's interesting that Director Comey from the FBI was actually testifying in Congress today, and he said that it's up to legislators to sort this out, and actually going through court cases is going to be a very long, drawn-out and difficult process, which will hamper investigations.
But it does seem like the law is where this needs to be decided, right? There needs to be a law. I mean, I don't think that Tim Cook's saying, like, you come up with a law and I don't like it and I'm not going to follow it. Like, he just wants a law. And it doesn't,
right, he wants some sort of,
Yeah, so he can decide I was only obeying the law and there's nothing we can do on it and take it up with your congressman.
Sure, because if Apple as a company gives in too easily on this, then they're seen as not really caring about their customers, who have kind of bought into this idea that they're safe using those products. It's kind of almost as if Apple would be complicit if they gave in too easily. Yeah. Another big challenge that Apple has is in protecting itself while making keeping themselves as a company protected while still making a product that's easy for general consumers. Like, for example, protecting iCloud with forced encryption might mean that, a user might accidentally lose the password. And then what happens? They lose all of that information, all that data, their photos that they kept on the servers. I'm not sure if the general public is ready for that necessarily, because they're not ready necessarily for the risks that come with being secure to that level. And Apple wants to make sure that their products are always very open to the consumer. And this, in some view, could be kind of anti-consumer, I guess, if that was the risk.
It's also a real problem for Apple in terms of marketing their phone abroad. I was speaking to the Silent Circle people who do Black Phone, the hardened Android phone.
Right.
80% of their sales come from overseas. And every time there's a story about the NSA or a story about this story, with the government seeking access to phones, their sales take a big boost. But what Apple and Google are worried about is that if they actually do comply and they do install backdoors, then their sales are going to tank. Because who honestly wants to buy a phone that can be hacked by law enforcement? It makes no sense.